So our next speaker is Lee Elliot Major, who's standing right here. And I scribbled down his biography, but it's quite long. So here are some fabulous highlights. So Lee started out as a journalist covering education at The Guardian and the Times Higher Education, and then he went from sort of hackery to being a chief executive of no other than the Sutton Trust, which is one of the premier organisations in the UK that works on social mobility. He became the country's, I think the world's, and therefore the universe's first professor of social mobility at the University of Exeter, which is just, kind of an astonishing title that it never existed before. So it's a huge privilege to have the only professor of social mobility here. Lee got an OBE in 2019, and we'd met online essentially shortly after. And it was in part because I came across, and this is not a cheap plug, his book, which I have right here and plan to finally get signed after encountering him, with the first time we actually meet in person. It's an amazing book with Steve Machen called Social Mobility and Its Enemies. It is tiny. You saw I pulled it out of my pocket. It actually is a perfect Penguin Pocket edition. And it really kind of summarizes the state of social mobility internationally. My favorite fact from it was how similar the UK and the US are in terms of how appalling they are at social mobility. And that fact has stuck with me since I read this book, so thank you so much. He's got more books. He's talking about his new book, Equity and Education, should you wish to invite him, and you enjoy his talk, you wish to invite him. Lee said he's very available to come anywhere in the world, including...
as well.
Well, I can volunteer for that too, with Emily Bryant. He's got two other books, What Works and What Do We Know, and What Should Be Done About Social Mobility. So not surprising, he will talk to us about social mobility, the rise and fall of meritocratic elites. Give it up to Lee.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Right. Okay. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Alex, you forgot to mention I have a PhD in theoretical physics, which usually stops conversation dead at parties, I find. And you're right. I am the country's, we think, the world's first professor of social mobility. I'm going to come back to that term because it's an interesting term, and a lot of the things that I propose aren't really social mobility. They're more what you might call social justice. They're creating conditions for there to be greater social mobility, but they're not in of themselves social mobility. But we'll come back to that. I'm going to give you a very different talk to a normal academic. I'm not a normal academic in any way. I'm going to try and give you a big picture interpretation of global trends. This is quite ambitious, this, in social mobility and education, and what are the sort of societal and policy and business implications of all this, all in half an hour. Yeah, I'll give you a taste of this. So, and I'm really scared because there's some really bright academics in this room as well. But I'm going to go over quite a lot of big graphs, and we can talk about it later over dinner, everyone, if you've got challenges on the methodology. But I wanted to give the audience a sense of what I see as the global trends, right, and what we might be able to do about them. Now, I always start with, I do lots of lectures for trainee teachers. I'm in a school of education and undergraduates, and I do tell my own story. And this story, my friends say, seems to get bigger every year. I tell it, and there's increasingly few people who are old enough to remember this now. But it very much for me is a personal as well as professional passion, this kind of notion of social mobility, of opportunity, of equality of opportunity. And I'm not going to go through the whole story here because I could go on all day, honestly. But the reason I want to share this with you because I think it reveals some of the challenges, some of the tensions, some of the questions in this discussion. And remember, I'm unusual in that I'm bridging the sort of academic world with the policy and practice world. So I'm really unusual in that respect. So I'm thinking as much about policy and practice as I am academic results. And a lot of my work is really synthesizing a lot of what brilliant academics are doing and trying to sort of see the big picture. I don't think there's enough of us, actually, that are cross-disciplinary in the way I am. So I will talk to economists. I even admit that I'm friends with economists, but I will also talk to sociologists, the educationalists, the psychologists, etc., etc. So it's quite hard actually to keep that sort of sense of what all these disciplines are doing, and doing that from a global perspective. So my story, I was, and this was a French TV interview. They got somehow found me and were obsessed with the fact that I was a punk at some point. I was actually a post-punk, technically speaking. Okay, I'm not quite that old, but that was me in the 1980s with blonde, spiky hair. That's me. For those of a certain age in Britain, certainly you'll remember a band called Curiosity Killed the Cat. Does anyone remember that? Everyone says I look like that guy, but I got the hat before him, right? So he had a hat. He was quite famous for a year or so. So I do sort of provide these pictures just as a bit of fun. But I am myself first in my family that went into higher education. I lived on my own at 15. There's a whole story for those coming to dinner. I can tell you much more about it. I lived on my own from age 15, so I was quite unusual in many ways. When I went back into academia, it was a teacher who took me under a wing. I did apply to Cambridge. Cambridge gave me an offer, but I didn't go to Cambridge. I went to Sheffield University, and the rest is sort of history, which Alex was talking about. Now, this was a Daily Mail article. I was Daily Mailed, which is a really disconcerting experience, I can tell you. It was during the pandemic, and the Daily Mail rang up and said, "We're going to do a story on you." And what have they found out about me? It was during that pandemic when all the schools were closed, and they wanted someone to back their campaign, which was to give laptops to children in the home, working in the homes. I'm not sure what happened to this, by the way, this campaign. But anyway, at the time they were speaking a lot about it, and they'd found out that I was a bin man when I was younger. Now, you have to be really careful with these stories. I was a bin man. It was nepotism. My mum worked for the local council in West London. I was doing the PhD in theoretical physics at the time. But the journalist couldn't resist this kind of what I would call a very narrow narrative of social mobility. I call it the American dream sort of version, which is plucking the disadvantaged person and them being catapulted to this sort of successful position. And I'm very proud of that journey. But when I do sessions with primary school pupils, I love doing the sessions, we talk about what we value in life. And my whole point of this story is that I think we should value bin men as well as professors. And the principle that guides my work is background shouldn't determine what you do, whatever it is you choose to do. And we'll come back to this because I think as universities, we do need to widen access to those people from all different backgrounds. But at the same time, we need to value people that go on to do different things. And I do a lot of work with schools about valuing people that do jobs in the local community that might not go off to Exeter or Oxford or whatever. So I think one of the things I'd just say to you all with these debates is just we have to be careful slipping into what I call deficit mindset, which is we value particular successful things in life and we denigrate other things. I would say bin men are more useful than professors in many ways. I mean, professors spout rubbish off no, no, bin men pick it up. So beware the deficit mindsets in all these debates. And when I talk to global employers about that, I'm really trying to emphasize for them thinking about all the roles in their businesses and how they value people from different class backgrounds. I would argue we should acknowledge and respect those people from different cultural backgrounds. I still see myself as someone coming from working class origins. I'm very proud of some of the things that I have. We can again maybe talk over dinner some of these the things, the assets that I bring that maybe someone doesn't have from a more middle class background. I have, of course, become a middle class person as I am now. The other two things about this story, very quickly before I move on to some of the data I'm going to bombard you with about global trends, is I think it accentuates individual success as well. And I always make the point that it was a teacher that helped me. It was my mother's brother, Uncle Michael, who sadly passed away many years ago, who gave me a bit of money to go to college. It was my best friend's parents who took me in. I am a product of collective endeavour, and again I get really frustrated with some of the societal debates we have about opportunity because it tends to get positioned as a very individualistic thing. That we're all and it ties to these notions of meritocracy, that we're all sort of judged by how well we are doing in some way. I think we are all products of collective endeavour. And then finally, I was very academic. I was a traditional very natural academic. I believe that if I'd been more creative, more vocational, I had different strengths. The school system in England at that time I don't think I would have I've flourished in the school system. So just bear those sort of caveats to some of these things in mind. And Alex, I gave this as brand title for the talk. I'm really going to look at some global trends in this area of social mobility. This is an unlevel playing field I used for my TEDx talk a few years back, and it was just for me highlighted some of the extent of the divides in society. But it's also this metaphor we use a lot in this debate, which is how do we level the playing field? How do we divulge the rules of the game? I'll come back to a bit of that. I'm quite interested in Pierre Bourdieu and the notion of cultural capital and habitus actually, and in the workplace particularly, I would argue that globally we are seeing some of those sort of markers of class being proxied or being assumed as talent when we need to be really careful with some of those things. Right, so what do we know? We've always spoken about me. These are the books. Thanks, Alex, for the plug on that. Social Mobility and its Enemy is actually published in China. It's being published in China soon, so I'm really happy with that. How many copies it will sell, I don't know. And we might come back to China because I'm really interested in some of the data. You said that the thing about social mobility and its enemies was that UK and US are very similar. My view, and we'll come to the first slide here, is that other countries are kind of following the trends that we've seen in the UK and US. So the left-hand graph is my good old friend John Goldthorpe and Bess Bicody, not too far from here at Mansfield College, who have done, I think, some of the best work in sociology in looking at trends. This is what we call absolute mobility, okay? So this is literally, in terms of occupational social class, are you doing worse or better than your parents did at a similar age? And that blue line is the levels of absolute mobility. So you'll see, and John and Beth, they'll talk about the sort of boom, the boom of absolute mobility in the post-war years. But you'll see the really interesting, I think, switch, if you like, is that 1980 cohort. So these are successive cohorts that we look at in these national studies. This is for the UK. And I think it's a really important trend here, and I think it's fueling some of the political debates that we're seeing, the very polarised and populist debates, is that from 1980 on these measures, a lot of people are now doing less well than their parents did, okay? Now, the right-hand graph is a Raj Chetty graph, an American economist who I was with actually last week and talking about some of this stuff. And what I would say is this is where the economists and sociologists agree. There's lots of things they disagree on in this literature, I can tell you, which we could spend a whole week on. But again, when Raj Chetty looked at income, in America, the land of opportunity, you'll see that blue graph was the proportion of people that were doing better than their parents in income terms, a previous generation. But you fast forward to those born in 1980 and you will see lots more people doing less well. Now, what's interesting is that when you look at the OECD, and there are caveats to all this data, my view is that you see a similar trend starting to happen in other countries. It's really fascinating. We don't have as much data as we'd like. But I believe that this is almost a societal trend that if you have modern capitalism, that you see this sort of opening up of opportunity, if you like, and then it closes down. Now, this is absolute rates. The thing that this disguised, right, in those early days was if you look at relative social mobility rates, right, how much, to what extent have you equal chances to someone from a more privileged background, say, that hasn't changed hardly at all, actually, the sociologists would argue. And it's not that much different for different countries in many ways when you look at the occupational class literature. And in many ways, I think what's happened over the last 80 years is that rise in absolute mobility, we were doing better than our parents, sort of hid the fact that actually we still had a very persistent class, I would call it, social class divide in this country and other countries. And that is kind of being exposed now. So in the old days, you might not have been able to climb the social ladder, but at least you were doing better than your parents. Now you're doing less well than your parents. And I think some of these sort of class divides, I would call it still a class divide, are being exposed. So this is a really important trend. I think it's happening globally. And we'll come to what I think employers should be doing here as well, because I'm going to show you that sadly, I don't think education systems are able to equalise the playing field in the way that we might have hoped. Again, I could have spent an hour on each of these slides, everyone. I apologise, I got excited as ever. in Social Mobility and Its Enemies, we also talked about, this is the famous Great Gatsby curve. We had a lovely discussion with Alan Kruger. I don't know if people know of Alan Kruger. He was Obama's economic advisor at the time. Amazing guy, and I had a lot of discussions with him. So this has caused a lot of controversy in the economic literature. It's really a correlation. So really what Miles Korak, a good friend of mine, a Canadian economist, did was chart that the levels, this is relative income mobility, okay? It's on the y-axis, isn't it? Yeah. And then the Gini coefficient, the levels of inequality, are on the x-axis, and you get this straight line. And what Korak was suggesting was that this was a causal relationship. If you like, the rungs of the income ladder are higher, are wider, so it's harder, if you like, to climb up that ladder. Now, this has caused all sorts of debates within the literature because, of course, it's not causal, this relationship, right? But he was inferring that. I wanted to share it with you because I do think if you can have a serious conversation about social mobility, I do believe that you need to think about that income inequality as well. So a lot of politicians think that when they talk about social mobility or income mobility, it's almost a sense of we're not going to have to deal with redistribution or the poverty or inequality rates that we see in society. I would argue, and I think Kruger would argue, that that's probably not the case. And this is the famous graph that showed that. We'll come on to wealth in a bit, but I couldn't resist this. By the way, I got quite a few Oxford references in this because I thought I'd be in Oxford, and I'm going to mention some of the things that you've done for us. Now, any idea here? This question: how many universities have produced English prime ministers since the war? Any idea? Two. But this is a bit of a trick question. It is one, and it's Oxford, as you might guess. Now, Gordon Brown was Scottish, so I word this. This question is worded very carefully because there's always a bright undergraduate that says, "Lee, what about this?" So Gordon has got, and Keir Starmer, of course, went to Oxford as a postgraduate, right? So he went to Leeds as an undergraduate. So I'm kind of, keeping on to this statistic. There are other prime ministers like John Major who didn't go to university, but it is amazing. And my God, Oxford's produced some very strange people over the last 50 years. I mean, so the reason I share this with you is because I'm not going to, as I said, my principle really, I suppose, is more closely aligned to social justice. In the background should determine what you do, whatever it is you do in life. But still, in the UK, we have an issue at the top of society. And I think if you do, you have increasingly dysfunctional, I would argue, and detached elites. For those that these people are in charge of. And I would argue things like in England, further education colleges always seem to be bottom of the priority because very few politicians have gone through the FE college route. So anyway, just to bear in mind, again, what's really maybe depressing but challenging for us, I'm seeing the same trends in other countries as well. So this is another review that I found, and they were arguing that it isn't just UK. It's basically most countries. You're seeing this increasingly sort of detached political elite. The other thing that we're observing in the literature, and again, there's never enough data on this, and I'd love to hear more from the academics in the room if they can show me more studies in this area. But the other thing that the economists certainly in that former graph, they're just looking at income. What we know is, of course, that it's wealth that's having an increasing impact, particularly at the top ends of society. This is an American study, and this is just looking at again, those cohorts. They just called them the millennials and the baby boomers. The millennials are the later cohort. But what you're seeing is, and I honestly, I can't remember how they defined wealth, so we'd need to look that up. But essentially, on their measure of wealth, you're seeing this increasing concentration to those upper deciles. And again, I've seen this in the UK, US. I suspect this is happening on a global basis as well. It really impacts on opportunities. So I still live in London. There are many people that are good friends of mine that are very wealthy but have low income. So they will qualify for all sorts of student for their children, all sorts of student maintenance that my partner, who's a nurse, and I don't qualify for, and yet they'll be sitting in £5 million houses in North London. So I think we just need to be a bit more aware that wealth as well as income driving some of these opportunities. People talk about the bank of mum and dad a lot in the literature. So education, the great social leveler, perhaps. This is an advert I found a few years back. It's from a community college in the US, and I think for me it encapsulates that notion of education. And for me personally, this was true in many ways. That's not me personally, but the idea is this is before that sliding doors term that became sort of a popular term in society. But it's a very clever advert. You know, you get into this college and you will do well. It's really interesting. It's very utilitarian, isn't it? It's very about money. It's about money. That's the sort of and the person seems to get very happy. It seems to be if he goes. If he doesn't go, I always feel sorry for this very poor glum chap at the end here who's not earning much and is very morose and sad. And it really encapsulates that notion of education as the great leveler. The problem is it doesn't hold up to our evidence base. And again, you see this in every country. Highly selective universities like Oxford and Exeter and others, we in many ways have become these sort of pipelines that feed those elite companies and firms across the world. So what you see, this is another Oxford person here, Breen, who showed actually that it's those. This is the social using occupational social class. You're seeing that top fifth, if you like, occupational classes. Actually, it's not the fifth. We'd have to look at the definition of it. But essentially, those class groups are pulling away. That's just looking at the graduation rates at those Russell Group universities, the highly selective universities in the UK. What's really interesting is you're seeing this globally. So if you look at the Grand École, if you look at the C9 universities in China, if you look at the Institutes of Technology in India, the Ivy Leagues, you see a very similar trend. And I'm trying to compile at the moment some of the intake statistics for those institutions, and then to what extent they feed some of the elites in the workplace across the world. And you're seeing an increasingly sort of globalized picture around this. This OECD graph is just showing you the chances of getting into tertiary education if your parents didn't have any school qualifications or had very low education qualifications, and you'll see it's kind of leveled off. There was a bit of progress. This is again looking at cohorts. I'm very interested in long-term trends, okay, because it's very easy to cite one study, and I do sometimes do that if it confirms my prejudices. But really, you've got to think about long-term and try, in my view, synthesize some of those studies. So this is just another fact that you know there's lots of studies that have looked at elites across the world, you know, and many universities, as I'm sure you heard earlier, are trying to think about how they attract young talent from a range of backgrounds, but are struggling partly because of those inequalities earlier in society. But it's really important because these universities are feeding those global companies in many ways that are so good to be part of if you're from one of those backgrounds. So the other thing that I suppose I just wanted to mention here is that there are divides over and above education. Okay, so if you look, there was one lovely study in the UK that showed, was it lovely? That's not the right term. That showed that someone with the same degree from the same university, same subject, if they're from a less privileged background, they are less likely to earn as much as their more privileged counterpart and get promotion. So there is something that happens over and above education that are creating these, if you like, opportunity divides. Now, I'm really interested in, I was saying to it earlier to Alex, is these studies, because you can find some really stark differences if you look at social class or income or other background characteristics. But what I like is the studies that actually control for achievement or in some sense, because I think that can be more powerful, particularly at a time when I'm sure you've probably all spoken about it already, when we're getting a bit of a backlash against things like DEI and diversity. The next book I'm doing, Alex, and it won't be out till 2026, is really arguing for socioeconomic diversity in employers and social mobility, but really doing from what I call it a sort of asset almost based approach, which is this is about talent. This is about, the argument is we are missing out on talent and diverse talent, different talent, but lots of talent. So I think we're going to have to, I can argue the moral case. I've been arguing that for most of my life. I think we're going to have to really argue the core business case in many of these. So I love these studies that control for talent in some way. There's all sorts of caveats to all these studies, of course, but I think there is a powerful and growing literature that suggests that we are missing out on many talents in the workplace. Um, I wish I had more time to go over all this stuff, right? But there's a separate literature as well that has been exploring this idea of Bourdieusian sort of class markers. So these are things that we think we judge as talent. We unconscious. There's a whole literature, by the way, around unconscious bias as well, and the fact that we treat people from different backgrounds and we make all sorts of judgments about people because of the way they speak and look. But there's a separate literature that sort of complements that, which really uses the ideas of Pierre Bourdieu particularly. And these tend to be more qualitative studies, but I think increasingly interesting and applying to a range of countries. So this is looking at often the elite workplace. And again, we can sort of come back to how we define that. But these are big global corporations that are attracting talent a lot from those institutions that I spoke about, those universities. It's really interesting, this stuff. So in the UK and to some extent the US, from what we can tell, there is things like accent hierarchy. So I always say in international conferences, I used to talk like David Beckham, and now my brother says I sound like Tony Blair, right? And my accent has shifted. Now, a lot of people in Britain, we have these sort of discussions. I get asked in Britain, why did you change your accent? I didn't do it purposely. I think I just fitted into the new world that I now inhabit. But certainly there are some studies that suggest these things can be really quite powerful. So one study, and it wasn't UK, I think it was more US. It suggested, no, it was India actually. And it was looking at caste as well as class. And it was suggesting that you were about 30 to 50% less hireable or perceived to be as competent if your accent is not that sort of neutral accent without that regional twang. There's an urban rural thing going on as well. Now, listen, this is early days, so I'm just looking at all the studies on this. But the big question for me is to what extent, and I talked to some Nordic colleagues here about, does this play out in other countries to the extent it does UK, US? What we find, and I just tried to summarise, this is how you speak, how you look, what you enjoy. Hobbies is another thing. So a lot of these things come into selection when senior people usually, and they're ignoring their heads of HR, heads of people, or diversity, and they say, look, I just want to see if this person fits in. What is their cultural fit? And as soon as you do that, as soon as you go into those informal selection sort of processes, you start falling into these biases and assumptions. And we found in a lot of the papers now, they're suggesting that if you say, for example, in England, it's probably skiing or rowing or rugby, all these things signal certain class markers. In other countries, it's really interesting. There was one in Norway, and that was it was more subtle. I think it was cross-country skiing, rather, because everyone skis in Norway. So there's really subtleties around this. So I'm obsessed with trying to map out the world in what markers play out in different countries. I think they probably do vary by country, but they are certainly there. And my view is that this is again further evidence around some of these opportunity divides. Where you're educated now, these are subtle, these things, because again, I think you've got to be really careful with your responses to this. I'd be interested in Sarah's view on this as well. I would argue that Oxford or Harvard are signalling something. So I personally wouldn't just. So some law firms will actually take out all the education credentials, right? They used to upset me when I was chief executive at Sutton Trust because we did the job of trying to get state school pupils into Oxford, and then someone said, "Well, now we're not going to even look at Oxford." I think that the literature would suggest that we overweight Harvard and Oxford when we're doing those sort of. But I'm not sure. I think we need to then just be really clear for selectors that you are prone to overweight it. I'm not sure I would get rid of it totally. And again, these are some of the subtle debates I think in response to this, and this is what I sort of call asset based. What I really think when I talk to business leaders, you have to avoid, and I know Sarah's like this as well, is that I think you have to avoid that sort of idea of dumbing down or tokenistic sort of representation in universities or in employers. Whether you'll play the game, I'm absolutely obsessed with this. In education, I do a lot of sessions with teacher leaders around what I call self-advocacy. So again, these are generalizations and you always have to be careful with them. But there's a lot of literature in the education field that has been inspired by that Pierre Bourdieu that talks about self-advocacy, concerted cultivation. So these are the things that I've done with my children. It's teaching them how to speak over the dinner table. Now they've got their headphones on, and we're losing we're losing it all now, aren't we? But to some extent, when you're in a middle class family, you are teaching your children the rules of the game, how to speak, how to advocate for yourself. I would argue it's quite an individualistic thing as well. And again, there's some lovely literature in the psychology world, academic world, where there's some really nice reviews about the assets that those from adverse backgrounds bring to them. So I would argue resilience, interdependence, things like this that perhaps we don't value as much in universities and employers as we could do. So there's a piece here, I think, which is being clear about what the rules of the game are, because I think we're going to stick to some of these rules. I'm not saying chuck them all out. So I think for someone who hasn't been taught that, I think we need to be clear about it, but maybe assessing some of our selection mechanisms as well, so that we level that playing field. So I would say the interview is a quintessential middle class selection process. So I still feel, believe it or not, I feel like I'm in trouble every time. I've been for government positions where I've been, the panel of experts, and there's a bit of my brain thinking, oh my God, I've done something wrong. And Lee, come now. If you are used to that kind of public argument, if you like, then I think you're just going to be less stressed in that situation. Again, I'm not saying we get rid of interviews, but I just think we need to be much more aware that cultural and class backgrounds have a profound impact on people in those situations. We could come back to, and by the way, often in those interviews, you're not actually testing for public performance. You're testing for some other skills, right? So part of this is being really clear about the competencies that you're looking for. I've talked a bit about this earlier, and I think Sarah probably spoke to this. And I, by the way, one of the things I would say is we should make socioeconomic background a protected characteristic in this country and elsewhere. But I think this is just me trying to get to that point of, I think there's a double-edged side to this for big employers, is thinking about how you select talent, and I would argue there's a real business case in thinking about this, but also, being really, really clear about what are the things that you want from people, because not everyone will naturally have those. So I said I'd do 30 minutes. It's about right here, and I've covered a huge amount of ground. I wanted to end with an American president. I thought about Trump, but I thought no. And although Trump, interestingly, said he wanted to create a merit-based society, it was interesting, wasn't it? I think my definition of merit might be slightly different to Donald's. One of my heroes is FDR, because at a time when America and the world faced real difficulties, I think he had a good strategy, and he mentions this term social justice. So there was free higher education for those GIs, coming back from the war. There was also the New Deal, as you know. There was also help for housing. So that bit about wealth I was talking about earlier. And I think a lot of the New Deal was about practical things as well as academic things. So listen, I know it's hard to repeat history, but I would say that some of the things that he did really not only were about creating a fairer society, but in my view, I don't have the papers to back this up, everyone. This is just my hypothesis. It created that economic boom that you saw in America in those sort of post-war years. So social mobility in the workplace makes economic as well as being fairer for society. I will finish there. Happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.